from to address all the urgent needs of our community. Yesterday marked the first day of phase one of reopening in the New York City region. Thanks to New Yorkers' hard work and diligence, our region is moving ahead with the reopening process, and we must still adhere to public health guidelines to ensure that that continues. Our office continues to work remotely, and we are here for you to answer any of your questions by email, phone calls, fax. So please be in touch with us and let us know how we can help. During the month of June, we're celebrating Pride Month. I'm a proud ally standing up for the rights and the visibility of the LGBTQ+ community and fighting bigotry of any kind. Next week, we will be discussing LGBT rights in this virtual Town Hall Tuesday platform. In the Assembly, I am proud of all that we have accomplished in the name of equality. This Pride Month, we should reflect on the history of the movement that started with a single riot on June 28, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn. We continued our work in Albany this week on what is being called the Say Their Name reforms, a historic police reform package. Our actions today that I co-sponsored, repealing the law known as 50A, which currently seals the discretionary records of police officers. This package also bans police chokeholds, criminalizes race-based calls to 911, and enshrines into law the designation of the New York State Attorney General Tish James, who we are so fortunate to have join us this evening. She is the special prosecutor in cases where police are accused of crimes. We have all heard the call of the peaceful protesters. We must all stand for genuine criminal justice reform and against bigotry and discrimination. Like most New Yorkers and most Americans, I am deeply distressed by the shocking television images of violence in major cities across this country, including here in New York State. The violence against George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others by law enforcement officials, which led to their deaths, must be condemned. These are terrible tragedies on a long list of even longer history. The legislation that we passed this week would also mandate body cameras for all state police officers on duty, create the Police Statistics and Transparency STAT Act to bring transparency to police records. It would require the state and local police and peace officers to report to a supervisor within 6 hours of the discharge of a service revolver under certain circumstances. It would amend the civil rights law to affirm a person's right in custody to prompt, reasonable medical care. It would prohibit law enforcement officers from profiling based on race or ethnicity and create a statewide public database containing data on motor vehicles and pedestrian stops by police. It would allow any victim of racial or ethnic profiling or the Attorney General to bring an action for damages or injunctive relief to stop improper profiling. While the current events are just one part of a longer history of racial injustice, we are at a turning point in the movement towards a more just state and nation. And I was happy to be a co-sponsor of each of these bills. I am proud of the peaceful protests and demonstrations I've witnessed in our community on the Upper East Side. I walked side by side with neighbors and joined the vigil in Carl Schurz Park to show solidarity and support to those who have died because of police brutality and racism. Because George Floyd's life mattered, because Breonna Taylor's life mattered, because all Black lives matter. Our first guest, a dear friend, made history when she was elected as Attorney General for New York State, becoming the first woman of color to hold statewide office in New York and the first woman to be elected Attorney General. Attorney General Letitia Tish James is truly the people's lawyer. Her ascendancy, her outstanding record of accomplishment, and unyielding commitment to social justice and equality are an inspiration to the young and old alike. To all of us, we consider you a trusted member of our family and the family of New York. You often remind me of the late Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who said, I am and always will be a catalyst for change. Attorney General Tish James, welcome to Town Hall Tuesday, where we proudly display a picture of you at our storefront community office. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Seawright, and thank you for your friendship. Thank you for adopting me, and thank you for all the work that you're doing in Albany. And thank you for passing this package of police reform bills. It is certainly overdue. And thank you for codifying the SIPU unit in the Office of Attorney General and expanding the Office of Attorney General. I really, truly appreciate it. In such a time as these, it's an honor and a privilege to serve as the Attorney General of the great state of New York, as someone who has committed her career to justice, and as someone who is now witnessing the intractable walls of racism crash to the ground. I live a few blocks from the arena, Barclays Arena, which is the town square, if you will, for the protest. And they march right outside of my house each and every day. And what's so great and what warms my heart is to see the diversity amongst the young people. And so thank you for allowing me to say a few words. I know this has been a resource for the community during this crisis, COVID-19. And thank you, obviously, because we are now witnessing another crisis and a crisis of outrage, not only throughout our nation, but throughout our country, but throughout the globe, in reaction to the brutal killing of George Floyd. America is reeling. Our people are rallying in the streets to call for systemic change. So today we are coming together really to meet, to make our voices heard about both racial injustices and the injustices that are being exposed by COVID-19. We are seeing the racial fault lines, and it's really critically important that we use our positions and we use our power to address some inherently and institutional racism that unfortunately continues to exist. Race continues to be with us, and one way to address it is we've got to confront it, recognize it, and come up with some constructive solutions. As you know, my office is conducting an investigation into the interactions between the police and the protesters during these days. And so I do not want to prejudge the investigation, but I want to say to all of your constituents, if anyone has witnessed any abuse, please contact our office. If anyone has any videos, please contact our office. We will be holding a virtual hearing shortly. And let me announce that we have appointed 2 advisors, Loretta Lynch, the former United States Attorney General, who will be advising us on this investigation, as well as Mr. Barry Friedman, who's the Executive Director of the Policing Project at NYU Law School. He's also a scholar on the Constitution and on policing practices, not only in New York, but all across this nation. And what I can say is that all Americans have the right to peacefully protest, and I will defend that right and guard that right. And so I urge all of the individuals to peacefully protest and to make sure that their grievances are heard. Dr. King once said that protest is the language of the unheard. And certainly we are hearing the language of all of those who want to see change in this nation. And the city of New York and cities and states across this country have reached a tipping point of anger and frustration after years of racially charged police violence. And so that's what we are seeing all throughout the city. The pain, the frustration, the loss of life of Black people, and particularly Black men, is devastating and truly, truly painful. I understand and feel the pain and frustration. I worry often about my nephew, my brothers. I worry about some of my loved ones. I pray that they all come home safely. And this really should not be the case in a country where it values equal justice for all, and what we are not seeing equal justice for all. As you know, I was one of the first ones in the aftermath of the killing of Eric Garner to call for body cameras. And we now have body cameras in New York City. And I want to thank you for your vote in expanding body cameras to state police. I truly appreciate it, because now individuals can witness what most Black people have known is true, and that is the abuses that we have suffered. And so it's really critically important that we equip all law enforcement with body cameras. And this is not to say that all officers are bad. My sister is a detective in NYPD, but there are some bad apples, just as there are bad apples in every industry, including politics. But our country right now is more divided than ever before. I think we're more divided than we've been since the Civil War. The images and the videos have seared my memory and penetrated my soul. And they show generations of pain and anger and discrimination. But I've also seen signs of great hope, and that is young people, Black and white and Asian and Latino, marching and praying with their feet, demanding justice. And that's why this movement is different. And that's why this movement is moving state legislatures and local municipalities to action. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be here and to be a part of history. We've seen all of the diverse crowds in every state and every small little hamlet. It's been absolutely warming. And so that's what I hold on to. I hold on to knowing that a generation of young people obviously are marching for change in our country, and who recognize that Black lives matter, which is not to say that other lives do not matter, but that all lives matter. And that includes and is not limited to Black lives. It's clear that my office, as you know, in regards to COVID-19, we've received thousands of complaints related to price gouging. I want to thank again the Assemblywoman for expanding our authority with regards to price gouging. We've seen price gouging ranging from toilet paper all the way up to toilet paper, to Lysol, to PPE. We've issued thousands of cease and desist letters. We've gone to court, again, getting injunctions against some of these bad actors. We've seen individuals prey upon seniors and those who are socially isolated. We've seen individuals bad actors who have gone door to door, pretending that they're from government, asking for personal information and bank information. And so we've investigated quite a bit of fraudsters. We've gone online. We work with online markets, again, to focus on fraud and deception, and those in the marketplace who would take advantage of the anxiety which continues to exist. But as we lower the curve, let us continue to adhere to the guidelines. Let us continue to practice social distancing. Let us continue to wear our mask, and let us continue to recognize that the virus is still not cured. And also, lastly, let me just say that individuals are also purchasing quite a bit of fraudulent products. Online, there's lotions and potions and even toothpaste that are basically marketed as basically cures to the coronavirus. There is no cure, my friends. And so at this point in time, the only treatment that's available is a treatment that has been authorized by the FDA, which is being diagnosed by, is being dispensed by doctors. And so please do not look for answers on the internet, and do not give out your personal information and or your financial information to everyone. We have, again, staved off individuals who seek to try to take advantage of the situation and garnish stimulus checks. And we've issued guidelines, and we've been working with the governor of the state of New York in regards to his executive orders. So, government cannot solve everything. It's really going to be up to all good people out there. And so at this point in time, we need to hear the voices of all good people, stand with others, demanding justice, demanding equal protection under the law, and recognizing the humanity of all of God's people, and recognizing that if we stay together, if we are united, we can overcome anything. I thank you so much, Assembly Member, and I thank you for your friendship.
Thank you, Attorney General Tish James. We appreciate your words and your leadership and all that you are doing for New York State. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is New York State Commissioner Jonathan J. Smith of the State Division of Human Rights. Mr. Smith is currently serving as the New York State Deputy Secretary for Civil Rights and Workforce in Governor Cuomo's office. His previous positions include the legal director at Muslim Advocates, a national civil rights organization tackling bigotry, senior counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. He's a graduate of NYU and Harvard University. Thank you for joining us tonight, Commissioner.
Thank you, Assembly Member. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening, as well as with the Attorney General and with all the people who have joined in to listen today. This is obviously a very bittersweet day. As you know, earlier today, we all, or many of us, witnessed the funeral of George Floyd in his hometown of Houston. And, obviously the protests that you mentioned, that the Attorney General mentioned, are about, in many ways, the horrific and totally unnecessary way in which Mr. Floyd died on the streets of Minneapolis. But they're also about a system of injustice, of racism, of intolerance that for too many Americans and too many New Yorkers, and particularly too many New Yorkers of color, has become the status quo. And the protests and the marches and the rallies are a reminder that although there is far too much injustice in our world and in our country and in our state, that there are people who are willing to stand up and to make a difference and to say enough is enough. And before I had the privilege of joining the Cuomo administration, I worked in the Department of Justice under Attorney General Lynch, and I remember being in the Department of Justice in the days following Ferguson, which felt eerily familiar to the days right now. I remember having conversations with my colleagues at the federal level about what can we do to make a difference? How can we end this endless stream of unnecessary death, unnecessary violence, and unnecessary racism and inequity? One thing that is really encouraging about this moment is that there are people coming together, and it's not just people of color, it's not just Black people, but it's all people saying we have to do better and that we can do better. And that if we work together, we could have a society and a democracy that lives up to its values and beliefs. And I do want to commend you and your colleagues for the package of bills that you have debated and passed this week, because that is a tremendously important step. And I am tremendously proud that the governor has pledged that he will sign those bills, and he will take that step to make sure that we make these reforms and that we begin to undo the harm and the destruction really that has been normalized in far too many communities. The other thing I would say is that the great thing about this moment and the great thing about being in New York in this moment is that we are a state that certainly knows its share of challenges when it comes to racism and discrimination, but we're also a state that has a history of standing up for what is right. The agency that I have the privilege of leading at this point, the Division of Human Rights, oversees and enforces the New York State Human Rights Law, which was the first state anti-discrimination statute passed anywhere in this country. And actually this year, we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of that law. And what that tells me is that we have a long history in New York of recognizing wrongdoing and discrimination and doing something about it, even before other people have. And I am optimistic that that same spirit and that same legacy is alive today. And I think it's evidence in the work that you and your colleagues have done. And it's evidence in the discussions that the Attorney General just had about the great work that she's doing. I believe it's evidence in the commitment that the governor has made to really tackle this problem and to stand with the protesters and to stand against inequity. And I think it's evidence in the rallies and the protests and the marches that have been taking place, not just in Brooklyn, but here in Albany and really all across the state. And so, I think this is a moment of challenge for sure. It's a moment of frustration, as a government worker, as a civil rights lawyer, and as a Black man. It's hard not to see what's happening and feel heartbroken and despair and a little bit, unclear about what's going to happen next. But then it's also, I think, really important in this moment that we also recognize that we have a legacy of greatness in the state. We have a legacy of standing up for what is right. And that is what I am confident will carry us through this moment. And I think it's also critically important, obviously we need to have some really difficult conversations about racism. We have to have some really difficult conversations about the way that we treat Black and Brown communities in our country and in our state. But I also hope that this is an opportunity to talk about discrimination and harassment more broadly, because certainly it's not just Black and Brown communities that are suffering. We talk about the fact that this is Pride Month, and we know that for so many LGBTQ populations that this is still a terribly difficult and scary place to live in. We know that for many immigrant communities that this is a very scary country to live in at this time, and people are not sure or clear that when their loved ones leave home, that they'll come back at the end of the day. That for women who go into the workplace, we know that there are concerns about harassment and mistreatment. And so, my hope, and I know this is a hope that's shared by the governor because he's spoken about it repeatedly in recent days, is that we have the difficult conversations, not just about race, but about all the ways in which people in our state continue to believe that they are less than simply because of who they are, or who are told that simply because of who they are, or what they look like, or who they love. And this is really an opportunity for us to lead the way and to do things differently. I would just remind all of your attendees tonight that the New York State Human Rights Division of Human Rights is open for business, that we've been open throughout the pandemic, that people are encouraged to go to our website, www.dhr.ny.gov, to file complaints, just like the Attorney General and the Attorney General's office and the City Commission. We stand ready to take and review and investigate complaints of discrimination in housing, in employment, in places of public accommodation. We also want to remind your viewers about our hotline that's available for any acts of bias, hate crimes, acts of discrimination or mistreatment. That's 888-392-3644. We also have resources available for Asian American communities in this time who we know have suffered unfair discrimination because of the pandemic. We have resources about gender, the really important bill that, again, you and your colleagues passed and the governor signed last year, providing critical protections based on gender identity and expression. And we just really hope that all New Yorkers take advantage of the resources we have. Of course, my hope is that no person suffer discrimination or harassment, but in the unfortunate event that they do, and I think we know from the last few weeks that far too many people do, we want to let them know that there is a partner and a resource and an ally in the state of New York and in the Division of Human Rights. And we hope that your constituents and really all New Yorkers take advantage of those services when they need them. And so thank you again. It's a privilege to be here, and congratulations on the great work that you and your colleagues have done.
Thank you, Commissioner Smith. We appreciate your joining us this evening and your words and all that you're doing and your leadership for New York State. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Daryl J. Cochran. He is an MPA, the New York City Commission on Human Rights. He's been there since June of 2015. He's the director of the Manhattan Community Service Center and LGBTQIA communities and the lead advisor with the agency's Community Relations Bureau. Previously, Daryl worked in public policy, government relations, advocacy, and communications at the Gay Men's Health Crisis, the New York AIDS Coalition, and the ALS Association for the Greater New York chapter. Prior to that, Daryl served as a community representative for U.S. Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York and served the Lower Manhattan community in the aftermath of the tragedy of September 11th. He holds a BA from American University and an MPA from NYU Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. So thank you, Daryl, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member. I appreciate you having us. Yeah, I just, want to talk a little bit about the City Commission on Human Rights. Our human rights law is one of the most robust in the nation, and we're very proud of that. Our agency's been around since Mayor LaGuardia founded us 76 years ago. And as part of that, some of the categories that we see in the human rights law, we work primarily in employment and housing. Those are probably our two biggest areas. And then we also work in areas of public accommodation and lesser known up until recently, provisions of the law in discriminatory harassment and bias-based profiling by law enforcement. So those are the areas in which we function. There are over 25 protected classes at this point. We just added one more a few weeks ago where employers can no longer test in the hiring process for prospective employees for marijuana. So while we've been all working from home during this pandemic, the human rights law has continued to expand, and we're very proud of that. I just quickly want to talk about some of the things we've been dealing with for the past few months. Obviously, during this crisis, there has been a lot of beauty coming out of the communities that we serve. A lot of people doing what they can to help their fellow New Yorkers, and that has been wonderful. One of the downsides, unfortunately, is that we have seen an uptick in discrimination in some communities, particularly in the Asian Pacific Islander community. We know in February through May of this year, we saw 145 new cases of discrimination specifically against folks in the API community. That compares to last year at the same time where we saw only 11. So that has gone up, 13 times what it normally has. So that is something that our agency has taken seriously, as well as, other communities that have been facing discrimination based on the COVID epidemic, also the Jewish community and LGBTQ communities. And our agency has responded to that with putting together a task force that really has fast-tracked those cases. If you know about the human rights law and filing complaints, sometimes it can take a while, but we're really determined to fast-track those cases and make sure people understand the seriousness of this and how we take it. Also, we have done a number of different community outreach efforts, particularly in the API community, where we have done town halls in Chinese, Korean, Japanese, as well as Tagalog. So that is something we're proud of in our outreach. And I also, want to talk about just yesterday, our agency released a report on anti-Black racism in New York. So please check that out. I'll actually put it in the chat once we're done here. But that is a report, it's about 74 pages, I believe, that really encapsulates what the Black community has faced. And I also want to be very clear, in the city's human rights law, in the protected classes, we have race as well as color, because we know that even though people may be of the same race, they're being discriminated against based on the color of their skin or the darkness of their skin. So that is, definitely something we're aware of, and we've been working on with various communities. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, also we put together a campaign that it was about $100,000, working with Ethnic Press to make sure that they're seeing the work that we do and they know how to get a hold of us. The easiest way is calling 311 and saying human rights, or you can go to our website, nyc.gov/human rights, and you'll be patched through to someone that you'll probably speak to them that day or within a couple days. So, I look forward to questions later on, and again, thank you for having us.
Thank you. And we do have a few questions that have come in from constituents. So we'll lead off with, how can one report police misconduct?
Is that for me specifically, or?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, let me close the chat so I can see better. Yeah, I mean, for us, for our agency, and maybe others want to chime in for the work that their agency does. But so as it relates to the City Commission on Human Rights, as I mentioned, there is the bias-based profiling by law enforcement provision of the law. So if someone feels that the police department has discriminated against them based on one of the protected classes in the human rights law, they could simply contact us by the ways I mentioned, and then they would work with our law enforcement bureau to work that out with them. If it does not relate to discrimination, then another city agency would deal with that, the CCRB.
You mentioned earlier there was an uptick in Asian American discrimination. What further steps have been taken to stop this hate crime against the Asian American population? Daryl.
Sure, thank you. Yes, like I mentioned, we have been having town halls in a variety of languages, and we continue to have that. We have been working with ethnic media outlets to ensure that folks are reading about our resources in the languages that are, best for them. And then also we have a campaign, and you could go to our Facebook page, and you can see a number of our staff talking about our agency, the services we provide in a variety of languages. I know not only with the API community, but with others, our commissioner, Carmela Morales, is very proud of the fact that when she started, we had about 6 languages spoken within our agency. Now we have about 35. So just really being able to interact with New Yorkers where they are in their language, that is something that is very important to us. And also, if you go to our website and look at our materials, you'll see most of our materials are in about 10 languages.
Terrific, that's great. Let's see, we have another question in from a constituent. Many people are protesting in large groups. What are some tips to protest safely? Commissioner at the state level.
One, individuals, first of all, in regards to the previous question, I would urge individuals to also contact the CCRB to file complaints, as well as reach out to the Human Rights Commission. And individuals, again, we are still in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone should presume that in fact they are infected and get tested immediately. Everyone should wear masks, and to the extent that you can, please exercise some degree of social distancing, wash your hands as much as possible. but it's really critically important that individuals get tested. It's really about testing, tracing, and treatment. That's how we're going to solve this until such time as we get a vaccination, which is not anticipated until next year sometime, hopefully. So please, please, please get tested. My office, we have worked with the governor of the state of New York and urged the governor to expand testing sites. There are more testing sites, particularly in communities of color, in and around public housing, and more testing sites that are available at a number of these urgent care centers for the individuals who are peacefully protesting. And I need to keep them safe. So please get tested.
Absolutely, and our office is very fortunate. We are giving out 2-ounce hand sanitizers and gallon jugs to local businesses. I'll hold it up here, and also face mask. And so please continue to practice safety cautions. And thank you very much, Daryl. And we're now moving on to our next speaker is Jessica Neuwirth. She is the author of Equal Means Equal. I'm going to hold up her book here because I held it up on the floor. Can you see it? Of the New York State Assembly whenever I debated the Equal Rights Amendment bill, which we passed the first week of session. And we have a broader Equal Rights Amendment bill that we're working on with Senator Liz Krueger in the Senate. And Jessica and the ERA Coalition have been tremendously helpful in helping to carve out the specific language. And I know our Attorney General has issued an opinion on that, an advisory opinion. So we are going to get the ERA done. And but Jessica Neuwirth is an international women's rights lawyer and activist. She's one of the founders of Equality Now, an international women's rights organization established in 1992, and the founder and director of Donor Direct Action, an offshoot project now hosted by Sisterhood, is a global institute to support women's rights organizations around the world. She is also founder and co-president of the new ERA Coalition, mobilizing a renewed effort to get the Equal Rights Amendment into the United States Constitution. So Jessica, we appreciate your joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's really an honor to be here with you and the Attorney General and all of the other panelists. And I really want to thank you for all of your work to promote the Equal Rights Amendment. I think we all know that not only women, but Black men were also left out of the Constitution when it was written. And I think we're still obviously suffering the consequences of that intentional omission and everything that's happened since. I want to introduce and thank my colleague, Anthony Brown, who is the chair of Hunter's Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latino Studies, for joining me tonight, because I just thought it might be interesting for us to try to do a little bit of a discussion about some of the issues that we're all facing. So I want to thank him for doing that with me. And I thought maybe just to start with, I could just take us back or kind of up to 10,000 feet to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a document that I don't think really gets enough attention. It was drafted under the chairmanship of Eleanor Roosevelt at the United Nations and adopted in 1948. And it really gives us a blueprint for human rights. It sets forth a single universal standard of human rights that's a very broad vision that I think has a lot to offer us. The first article just says simply, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's it. And then Article 2, that everyone's entitled to all these rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, including race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status. So again, as some member Seawright said, we don't have that even in our New York Constitution, but that's in this Declaration of Human Rights. And then what are these rights? Well, the civil and political rights are the ones we always expect: the right to life, liberty, and security of person, no one subject to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Obviously, that's an important one today. But there's also a number of economic and social rights in this document that are completely relevant, I believe, to these issues today. Article 23 says that everyone has the right to work, to just and favorable conditions of work and protection against unemployment, to equal pay for equal work. And Article 25 says that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, and other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So we're talking about a document in 1948 that really set forth a very holistic vision of what human rights mean in a practical way. And on the domestic side, of course, we have Franklin Roosevelt with these twin pillars of freedom from fear and freedom from want. So I think we have that. We have lots of blueprints. And I think the problem is they're just blueprints. And how do we make them real? And we're living in a world that is so far from that vision. How do we move towards it? I don't know. Some days, are we moving towards it? Are we not moving towards it? You know, we have to hope that we're at least moving towards it. But obviously, we are very, very far away from it. And in this year, it's been such a challenging year. We've just seen again and again this pandemic and how, you know, it has such a discriminatory impact on people of color and particularly Black Americans. And at the same time, we have this crisis of consciousness, which is not new, but has risen to a new level of visibility in terms of discrimination in the use of deadly police violence. So that's another pandemic that's coming to light. And I just would like to invite Anthony to maybe just say a few words about how is COVID-19's disproportionate impact on the African-American community related to the murder of George Floyd.
And before he starts, let me just give you a quick introduction, if I may. Okay. Professor Brown is chair of the Department of Africana and Puerto Rican Latin Studies. He has taught at the university level since 1997 and joined the department in 2001. He received his undergraduate degree from Cornell and a master's from UCLA. Trained as a sociologist, he earned a PhD from Columbia University. His research scholarship and teaching concerns issues related to Black communities with a focus on poverty, gentrification, sociology movements, and second-generation immigrants. His most recent publications focused on the impact of the Great Recession on Black and Latino communities in New York City. So welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Assembly Member Seawright, Attorney General James, and the other panelists. It's a pleasure to be here. Jessica, let me try to unpack your question in terms of the connection that I see between the murder of George Floyd and the disproportionate death of African Americans from COVID-19. And the way I connect them, and certainly many of my colleagues, is to talk about the impact of structural forms of discrimination. Right? We don't do a very good job in our society, particularly K through 12, at teaching us this complex history, right? And by that I mean the role that institutions play in perpetuating either advantages or disadvantages. And so Americans tend not to know that history. So one of the things that certainly in this current moment that I find gratifying is the number of folks who are searching for material right now so they can get a better historical grasp, if you will, in terms of how and why our society is the way it is. So you look at the New York Times bestseller list, you see a number of scholarly works being purchased in the pursuit of understanding that history. So again, me and certainly many of my colleagues would argue that we need to understand how our past is intimately connected, if you will, to our present situation. Right? And these policies, again, confer various advantages and disadvantages for groups. So that's why we use terms like systemic racism, right? And certainly a term like that can ruffle feathers and people are unclear about what that means. But we're talking specifically about how our institutional policies, right, even though, again, we see individuals within these institutions, whether they be the police department, the educational system, healthcare, are well-meaning. But nonetheless, when we look at the cumulative impact over time of how these institutional policies and decision-making processes are carried out, we see, in this case, African Americans, again, continue to be at a significant disadvantage. Right? A colleague earlier mentioned anti-Blackness, which is a term that we see quite a bit by a number of scholars. Looking specifically, again, how and why African Americans find themselves, again, subjected to, again, these discriminatory policies. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I'm getting at. Just look at the 20th century. Right. Someone mentioned earlier FDR, again, an administration that certainly was quite instrumental in changing American society, without a doubt. But there were also undersides, if you will, of those New Deal policies. For example, think of FHA policy, designed to spur home ownership, right, as a result of the Great Depression, right? Specifically, when this legislation was crafted, right, African Americans were explicitly left out, right, of those loans that led to the suburbanization of America, right? Many of us are familiar with redlining, right? Redlining emerges during the New Deal, right? As, again, the administration essentially said that, again, those communities that were African American, they literally drew a red line around them and prevented them from getting access to mortgages and loans that would have allowed, again, Black ownership, home ownership, and by extension, the creation of Black intergenerational wealth, right? So that was a missed opportunity. And many would argue, including myself, that beginning, particularly in the 20th century, with those kinds of policies, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated communities, right? And those segregated communities, in turn, right, we see a number of very negative impacts that result from segregation, right? Again, we're talking in part about COVID-19. Part of the reason why African American communities were so ravaged is that they were weakened by generations, right, of policies, right, that in many ways impacted negatively African Americans' ability, again, to withstand a crisis like COVID-19. In particular, healthcare, right? The reason why we have such unequal healthcare systems is, again, the funding disparities that we see. So we can connect that. We can also connect policing, right? Part of going back, again, historically, in terms of structures and institutions, is how African Americans and people of African descent have been framed as, particularly by law enforcement, et cetera, as criminally prone, those who, again, are likely to engage in crime. And the institutions, in turn, have perpetuated that over time. And so, we see George Floyd, Eric Garner, and others, the kind of disparate treatment that these communities face is longstanding, as many on this panel have articulated. So again, we need to go back and look at, right, the institutional structures and begin to rethink and reimagine how we can dismantle, change them in order to create, again, a more egalitarian process in terms of how, again, African Americans and certainly other groups are treated, again, as a result of these policies.
Right. So, I mean, it seems to me to follow on what you're saying that a lot of this systemic racism would result in the disproportionate impact of COVID-19, for example, on the African American community. But I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the shift in the narrative when media started to cover the idea that African Americans were clearly being disproportionately impacted by the virus. How do you feel that was represented? And were these systemic issues that relate to poverty or housing or other of these structural areas of discrimination, do you think that was part of the narrative, or what happened with that narrative?
Okay, that's certainly an important question. I would say this, certainly when the virus first hit, we were all shocked, certainly as a nation in terms of what was occurring. But as we, again, as we follow the narrative, we saw a significant change. And by that I mean, as the narrative changed, particularly in big urban centers, whereby we began to see that African Americans were being disproportionately impacted in terms of infections and death, the narrative then began to change, whereby we began to talk about comorbidities, right, underlying health issues. Right? And so in many ways you saw, particularly members of the administration, federal administration, begin to, again, blame African Americans, if you will, for why they were dying disproportionately. And so a lot of discussion then emerged about, well, they don't eat the right foods, et cetera, right? Not looking again at structurally why, again, historically, African-American health, if you will, vis-a-vis the larger population has always been disparate, again, rooted in these larger structures. And so part of, as I mentioned earlier, part of this issue of structure is also a cultural piece, right? Meaning that there are narratives historically that we've used, right, to frame, right, and to shape our policies. And those narratives, particularly vis-a-vis African Americans, have always been, for the most part, pejorative, negative. Right, and so we've seen historically notions that African Americans don't value education. Again, I mentioned prone to crime, and so these help to absolve the larger society of any role or responsibility in terms of why, again, Black communities find themselves at such a disadvantage on so many fronts.
I mean, I'm really interested in the link between systemic discriminations and kind of institutional racism. I think what is particularly important for us to think about is what is the role not only of policy, but of people in all of this. So you look at this video that we've all seen so many times, and it's so painful to watch this police officer with his knee on the neck of a person, literally killing them in front of our eyes. And that's horrific, but in a way, like equally horrific are all the people standing around him, helping him, doing nothing. And, you know, maybe a couple of them have been charged, but that culture, you mentioned culture, the culture of, on the one hand, impunity, but on the other hand, almost like a brotherhood of oppression that just creates exactly the wrong message that you want to send. And I know there's been a lot of talk recently about the bad apples and all these bad apples, but I think, you know, when we look at the culture of the police, and it's really just a microcosm probably of the culture of our society, like, are we really talking about bad apples, or is it just a bad tree that might have an occasional good apple? Because I think, you know, you look at Buffalo, I mean, so many officers just having pushed this older man down to the ground, leave him in a pool of blood. Just walk by and leave him in a pool of blood. It's so painful to watch, you know, that kind of fundamental disregard for humanity. And that's a culture. And then when you see, okay, a couple of people are going to be maybe held accountable, 57 officers resign in protest. And you want them to be protesting the abuse, not the accountability. So what that tells me is that there's really like an ingrained culture that's very problematic. And then you look at how does that culture happen? And an incident that happened the same day that we all know here in New York that George Floyd was killed was this incident in Central Park where Amy Cooper was walking without her dog on a leash, and fully within his rights, Christian Cooper, Black man, asked her to put her dog on a leash. And then she called the police and lied and said that this Black man was threatening her life. And I think we all know that could have easily turned into an Eric Garner situation. You know, fortunately it didn't. But the only little ray of light that I saw in that was that her employer, a financial company, terminated her employment and said very publicly, we do not tolerate racism. And that felt a little new to me. That felt like, wow, if we could really move to a zero tolerance policy on racism in every place, in every police force, and in every company where people work, every place of employment, would that change person by person the institutional racism that we're facing? What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. You know, again, cultures are very important, as we both agree. And again, we have changed culture, you know, think over the last few decades, you know, we've changed think of how Me Too has changed our culture. We've changed the culture around smoking. We've changed the culture around drunk driving. And so we, again, we have those recent historical examples. The LGBT community, we've changed that culture. Certainly we have a long way to go on some of these issues, but the kinds of dramatic change were for many unimaginable maybe two or three decades ago. And so again, if we, again, muster the political will, right, to do so, we can, again, create that society that at least we rhetorically say we want, right? And so those kinds of sanctions can be critical, again, in changing people's expectations, people's behavior of what is acceptable.
And I guess, I am listening so hard these days as a person who doesn't have to face that fear every day in my life and my family. I think this is a moment for us to really listen hard and think about what more can we do to stop this and to reduce, and it'd be good to hear from you. What do you think we can do to reduce some of these health disparities so that COVID-19 doesn't disproportionately impact certain populations or deadly police encounters? How do we really move, is what I'm saying, towards racial equality?
Certainly, again, I believe listening is important, reading is important, as many folks are doing right now. But ultimately, that has to move towards policy, right? Changing our institutions, our policies in a way, again, that does not perpetuate, as I mentioned earlier, again, the disadvantages. So, for example, healthcare. We're the only industrialized nation that does not have universal healthcare. And this crisis has revealed, the COVID crisis, why that is such a problematic state of affairs for Americans to find themselves in. Too many Americans find themselves who do have health care, it's tied to their jobs. So what happens if you lose your job? You essentially lose your health care. And again, health care is also part of our public health infrastructure. Right. And so sadly, during the crisis, there were folks who may have had symptoms, of COVID-19, but were afraid of losing their paychecks. So they went to work and potentially exposed co-workers, fellow travelers, those who are commuting to work, et cetera. So again, this is a clear example these last 3 months of why we need Americans to have access to good, high quality healthcare. And we certainly have the infrastructure, the technology to make that happen.
And I would just bring us back. I know we wanted to leave some time for questions, but just to come back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We hear politicians saying, oh, healthcare is a human right, as if that's a new idea, but it's right there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's kind of ironic and sad that our country and Eleanor Roosevelt played such a tremendous role in creating that document, and we're yet one of the few countries that doesn't really even recognize in a universal way that this is a fundamental right. So, so with that, maybe we should just turn to questions, because I know we're running out of time.
Oh, Assembly member, you're muted. I'm sorry.
Our first question is from Ellen Pallavi of Roosevelt Island. As a sociologist, is there a way to explain the out-of-control behavior of police all over the country against protesters of all backgrounds? It would serve them to restrain themselves as proof that they are not bad actors. Yet we're continuing to see video footage. Is there a way to explain the out-of-control behavior of police all over the country against protesters of all backgrounds?
I'll take a stab at that. Again, I'm historically grounded, and I would say again that police forces have always, by and large, because of the absence of checks and balances on their behavior, have engaged in these actions. What is new now is the fact that we have what I call citizen journalists, people who can pull out their phones and document what has been happening. But again, we have, and again, cities and states are reluctant because of the power of police unions, I would argue, to in many ways enforce and create policies that can at least provide sanctions, if you will, for those who violate people's civil rights, human rights, etc. And so, for example, one of the discussions that we hear currently is that when cities are handing out settlements, some of that settlement should come out of police unions as budgets, right? As a way, again, to enforce some measure of accountability. Right, so that is one. Certainly, the quick firing of officers who, again, have been documented to abuse people's rights. Those, again, send a very strong message about the tolerance for abuse. And again, because we're in this current moment, we've seen several officers fired in quick succession in many cities across the country, which I would argue is probably unprecedented in modern American history. Jessica, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would just say it's the culture, is changing the culture of impunity to a culture of accountability. And yeah, it may be true that some of these officers are being fired, but I think a lot of them should be held criminally accountable. You know, and I think that one of the problems we saw, even with this incredible video, that it took 4 days to get that arrest. You know, that's just shocking to me. And then this person, this police officer had something like 18 other complaints that had already been filed against him. So if any one of those complaints had been properly handled, then we might, you know, still have George Floyd in our midst. And I think that that is such a tragic and needless loss of life, you know, when you have all those warning signs and they're ignored. So it's, again, that kind of crossover between culture and institutional interplay that I think has got to be changed dramatically.
Okay, thank you. We have another question in. What impact do you think the racial voting gap has on policy?
I'm not sure what is meant by the racial voting gap, but I would say that, let's go back to 2016. It's almost unimaginable when we look back now that more than 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, and also a majority of white men. And we've seen, you know, similar kinds of situations whereby candidates running for office who run on conservative platforms that are almost antithetical to particularly the class and racial interests of various populations, continue to be reelected, right? And that's a major obstacle to progressive change, I would argue.
I think, I mean, what I think is absolutely critical is to really get our voting rates up. I think that if we look at other countries in the world and we just see like it's just such a pathetically low number of people who turn out to vote. And the sad thing is when you talk to people, I mean, a lot of people just have so little faith in the system. They just feel like truly their vote doesn't matter. And sometimes, honestly, it can be hard to convince them otherwise, I think. And that's really a problem. We need to be able to inspire people to feel like their vote matters, to make it easy instead of hard for them to vote. And I, you know, this might be straying very far from our topic, but I think we also really just have to look at the Electoral College, because as a New Yorker, I just feel like my vote really barely counts at a federal level when it comes to electing a president, and that seems very undemocratic to me.
I would just add quickly, part of it is also the fact that money is considered speech in our society, right? And so I say that to say, if you ask, a majority of Americans would say, well, they support universal health care, they support jobs that pay a living wage, they support health care. But those issues become difficult when you have entrenched, powerful interests who have a vested interest in making sure that we don't have universal health care, we don't raise the minimum wage, right? We don't provide for affordable housing, right? And so you have an amplified voice by a small, wealthy, powerful, well-connected constituency that thwarts, if you will, the will of substantial majorities of the American populace.
All right, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Jessica Neuwirth, and all of our speakers. And I'd just like to ask the Attorney General to leave us with some closing thoughts as we move forward together during these challenging times.
These are challenging times, but I think the reality is that change is coming. There are a number of reforms. 50A is being repealed. We are now again talking about not defunding the police, but but basically reimagining the police and reinvesting in communities that have historically been under-resourced. And that's really critically important. I think recognizing the human rights and the humanity of all of God's people is really critically important at this time. I also think it's important, again, Ms. Newfield mentioned holding law enforcement officers accountable. I just want you to know how difficult it is to hold police officers liable. It is incredibly difficult. If you look at the number of cases that have been brought and the convictions, it's less than 1%. And part of it is the high standard. Part of it is the justification defense. And part of it is, again, we lacked objective evidence. Now that we have body cameras, and as you know, I was one of the first in New York City to advocate for body cameras. I think with body cameras and recognizing the importance of voting, but most importantly, the importance of serving on juries is so really critically important. And we've not had that discussion at all. And then we also need to have a discussion about voter suppression. But I am so glad that we are now moving to no excuse absentee ballot, early voting. I want to thank the Assembly member again for sponsoring and being part of that effort. And I think we are leading the way. And I think when we come out on the other side of the mountain, when we come out on the other side of COVID-19, as well as this crisis that we are witnessing in the aftermath of the murder or the killing of Mr. Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the list goes on and on, that we're going to come out more united and more connected to bringing down the walls of institutional racism. I thank you so much, Assembly member, and let's remain committed to justice, all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for those very special words, and again, for your great leadership. Our closing remarks, a final word for this evening. Our storefront office on East 79th Street is open virtually. Our staff is responding to the thousands of inquiries each week. We are committed to supporting the reopening of our community in New York City and providing information and resources to the district. We fought to ban PPE price gouging. We voted to pass legislation to ensure that masks and hand sanitizers are accessible and affordable. The governor assigned Assembly Bill 10270 banning price gouging of personal protective equipment. As we reopen, there is a critical need for these supplies in order to do business. If you own a small business in the community, please let us know. If you need PPE for your employees, we have gallon-sized hand sanitizer and face coverings available. If you've been a part of the peaceful protests, please get tested for COVID-19. There is a location for testing in our area at 215 East 95th Street. Advantage Care Physicians, 212-996-8000. We have to remain vigilant to keep the curve trending down. Just a reminder that while you are spending more time at home, you should fill out your census. Go to 2020census.gov. It only takes a few minutes. Please contact our office for the next steps if you have any questions. Every voter in New York State has the option to vote from home this primary and will be receiving an absentee ballot application. The deadline to mail in the application to request an absentee ballot is June 16th. Governor Cuomo recently signed legislation, Assembly Bill 10516, extending the deadline to submit absentee ballots until the day of the election. To be counted, primary ballots must be postmarked by June 23rd. Earlier today, we held our virtual town housing legal free pro bono clinic. If you need housing advice, please contact our office at 212-288-4607 or email our office at cwriter@nyassembly.gov to reserve a spot for our next housing clinic on June 23rd. Please stay in touch with our office for updates. Check out my Twitter account, CWrite for New York, or call our office, again, 212-288-4607. We will return next Tuesday evening with a new edition of Town Hall Tuesday with special guests to assist our community in this great time of need. During Pride Month, our focus next week will be on LGBTQ rights. Some of our speakers will be Judith Kaysen Windsor, David Kilnick of the Long Island Network, Melissa Sklarz from SAGE, and Dolores Covergrove from the Human Rights Commission, Greater New York. So please tune in next Tuesday. Until then, wear your mask, wash your hands often, and social distance. Thank you to all of our speakers this evening for joining us. And thank you to all our guests for listening in and for your wonderful questions. Thank you and good night.